Jihad vs. McWorld or Jihad via McWorld? Excerpted from Jihad vs. McWorld. Terrorism's Challenge to Democracy. Benjamin R. Barber. 1995. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Human beings are so psychologically needy, so dependent on community, so full of yearning for a blood brotherhood commercial consumption disallows, so inclined to a sisterhood that the requisites of personhood cannot tolerate, that McWorld has no choice but to service, even to package and market jihad. We have seen how athletic shoe salesmanship revolves around selling American black subculture, how American Express treats global travel, a privilege of McWorld, as a safari to exotic cultures still somehow intact in spite of the visitations and depredations made possible by American Express, how McDonald's adapts to foreign climes with wine in France and local beef in Russia even as it imposes a way of life that makes domestic wines and local beef irrelevant. McWorld cannot then do without jihad. It needs cultural parochialism to feed its endless appetites. Yet neither can jihad do without McWorld, for where would culture be without the commercial producers who market it and the information and communication systems that make it known? Modern Christian fundamentalists, no longer an oxymoron, can thus access religion forum on CompuServe information service while Muslims can surf the internet until they find Masood Kaji's Cybermuslim document. That is not a computer error, Cybermuslim is the title. Religion and culture alike need McWorld's technologies and McWorld's markets. Without them, they are unlikely to survive in the long run. Now to be sure, I have identified McWorld with crucial developments made possible by innovations in technology and communications that appear only toward the end of the 20th century. In a way, however, McWorld is merely the natural culmination of a modernization process, some would call it westernization, that has gone on since the Renaissance birth of modern science and its accompanying paradigm of knowledge construed as power. On inspection, there is little in McWorld that was not philosophically adumbrated by, if not the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, its trust in reason, its passion for liberty, and, not unrelated to that passion, its fascination with control, its image of the human mind as a tabula rasa to be written on and thus encoded by governing technical and educational elites, its confidence in the market, its skepticism about faith and habit, and its cosmopolitan disdain for parochial culture. Voltaire despised history, dismissing it as little more than a catalogue of humankind's errors and follies, while Enlightenment psychology assumed a single universal human nature rooted in right reason and set down in the greater harmony of the chain of being. In Alexander Pope's ripe imagery in his essay on man, all are but parts of one stupendous whole, whose body, nature is, and God the soul. Look round our world, behold the chain of love combining all below and all above. See plastic nature working to this end, the single atoms each to other tend, nothing is foreign, parts relate to whole, one all extending all preserving soul connects each being, greatest with the least, made beast in aid of man, and man of beast, all served, all serving. Nothing stands alone, the chain holds on, and where it ends, unknown. McWorld's advertent meretriciousness and its numbing commercialism, along with the fabulous curiosities of virtuality that have problematized the very meaning of reality, may seem novel. They raise questions of whether, for example, virtual communities organized around the internet are political or public communities in any meaningful sense, and whether information networks improve or corrupt public access and civic capacity. But novelty or no, there is little in our post-modernity that would surprise modernity's Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment champions like Pope, Voltaire, J. S. Mill, and Max Weber, or, for that matter, that would cheer up its Cassandras like Rousseau and Nietzsche, who had more than an inkling of how the Enlightenment would also write its own dark counterpoint. Alan Bloom was thus able to make the greater part of his complaint about our tarnished world today by rehearsing the spirited grievances of the ancients against their world then. What I have called the forces of jihad may seem then to be a throwback to pre-modern times, an attempt to recapture a world that existed prior to cosmopolitan capitalism and was defined by religious mysteries, hierarchical communities, spellbinding traditions, and historical torpor. As such, they may appear to be directly adversarial to the forces of McWorld. Yet jihad stands not so much in stark opposition as in subtle counterpoint to McWorld, and is itself a dialectical response to modernity whose features both reflect and reinforce the modern world's virtues and vices. Jihad via McWorld rather than jihad versus McWorld. The forces of jihad are not only remembered and retrieved by the enemies of McWorld but imagined and contrived by its friends and proponents. Modernity precedes and thus sponsors and conditions its critics. And though those critics, on the way to combating the modern, may try to resuscitate ancient usages and classical norms, such usages and norms ethnicity, fundamentalist religion, nationalism, and culture for example are themselves at least in part inventions of the agitated modern mind. Jihad is not only McWorld's adversary, it is its child. The two are thus locked together in a kind of Freudian moment of the ongoing cultural struggle, neither willing to coexist with the other, neither complete without the other. Benedict Anderson gets it exactly right when he conceives of that driving engine of jihad, the nation, as an imagined political community. Which brings us to the crucial question of nationalism, and its role in the struggle of jihad versus McWorld. The meanings of nationalism. Among the forges that animate modern jihad, religion may be at once the most noble and the most toxic, but none is so prominent as nationalism, according to Walter Russell Mead and many others, the most powerful political force on earth today. The trouble is, those who agree on nationalism's potency do not agree on its meaning. There is old nationalism and new nationalism, good nationalism and bad nationalism, civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism, nationalism as the forge of great states and nationalism as their coffin, East European nationalism, arrayed against external empires, Turkish, Russian, Austrian, and West European nationalism, arrayed against parochial forces inhibiting nation building, the nationalism of the liberal nation-state and the nationalism of ethne, of parochial politics and tribalism. As a moment in the anti-modern life of jihad, nationalism suggests narrowness, antagonism, and divisiveness, and seems to exist in a primarily negative form, ethnic and cultural particularism that aims at busting up the nation-state and flinging aside multicultural wholes in the name of monocultural fragments. Free traders and McWorlders use nationalism as a scathing pejorative denoting a fractious and anti-cosmopolitan tribalism, reeking of bloody fraternalism and equally toxic doses of the parochial and the primitive. Yet this is to distort what is in fact a far more dialectical conception of the nationalist idea in history. While it may seem to undermine integral states today, nationalism once helped fashion the states that forged the Enlightenment. As a consequence, it gained considerable momentum and a modernizing cachet of its own with the rationalistic, if often irrational, revolution spawned by the Enlightenment in France, America, and Germany. The aspiration to a liberal nationalism that united the cosmopolitan ideals of liberty and equality with the communitarian ideals of fraternity and solidarity motivated the Jacobins and the American founders alike, and permitted peoples bound by culture and history nonetheless to fashion constitutions founded on rights and reason. The Greek revolt against Ottoman rule that drew Lord Byron to his epiphanic demise in 1824, for example, gained decisive support from English Romantics and English liberals because national self-determination was perceived as the condition for the progress of liberty, and liberty was understood to be nationalism's noblest aspiration. No less a liberal than J.S. Mill had established what he saw as a necessary linkage between liberty and national identity, echoing Rousseau's assertion that only an integral nation could sustain a republican constitution. Liberal and Romantic nationalists from Herder to Mazzini subscribed at once to a religion of humanity deifying a single, cosmopolitan conception of human nature and a vigorous nationality. In Mazzini's arching rhetoric, nationality is the role assigned by God to each people in the work of humanity. During a brief grace period, in the French Revolution and its aftermath, when patriotism meant love of fellow citizens no less than love of country, Rousseau and La Patrie referred to the democratic republic no less than to the nation. This splendid amalgam of individualist ideals and communitarian identity politics, a synthesis of the religion of humanity and the secular story of nations, appeared to make it possible for reason to set down roots and thereby secure legal personhood in a grounded identity of nationalist flesh and cultural blood. Particularism and cosmopolitanism were joined in a French ideology of progress and revolution, and the true cosmopolitan was, as Paul Hazard recognized, someone who thought à la Française. This understanding of the nation made possible the creation of a constitutional state under the sovereignty of a people, folk, gens, peuple, or nation, the nation-state, which in turn offered the legal groundwork for democracy. To the extent our modern democratic institutions are tied to the idea of the nation-state, it has been a legacy of precisely this alliance between nationalism and liberalism. The marriage was, however, a peculiar one, a partnership defined from the outset by disequilibrium. And if, initially, history played along and the first half of the 19th century witnessed the stabilization of aspiring liberal nation-states in Canada and America, and in a certain manner France, as well as their rise in Italy and Prussia, by the end of the century liberalism and nationalism were becoming unstuck. Although the marriage was premised on the essential compatibility of freedom and parochial identity, in the cases of America, France, and Canada, pluralism was built into national identity, providing the indispensable glue. But in Italy, Germany, Greece, and the Balkans, it was not, and in time the marriage failed with particularly disastrous consequences. In Eric Hobsbawm's description, toward the end of the 19th century, nationalism had mutated from a concept associated with liberalism and the left, into a chauvinist, imperialist and xenophobic movement of the right. The radical right. The passing of liberal nationalism as a historical experiment was not the end of its career as social theory, however. The argument for the inclusionist liberal ideal of nationalism is made to this day by idealists who find in legal personhood too thin and abstract a basis for identity yet regard the actual record of historicist nationalism as too bloody and exclusionist to be made a basis for equal citizenship. Ortega y Gasset pointed out in the 1920s during a period of empire busting and nationalist aspirations that preceded the balkanization of the East, a period not unlike our own, that nationalism, having won its integrating national victories, was bound to change its strategy. In periods of consolidation, Ortega observed, nationalism has a positive value, and is a lofty standard. But in Europe everything is more than consolidated, and nationalism is nothing but a mania. In our own well-consolidated era, while the new nationalism does seem to have become a kind of toxic mania for deconstructing states, there are still voices urging the inclusionist model. Yael Tamir thus believes that the liberal tradition, with its respect for personal autonomy, reflection and choice, and the national tradition, with its emphasis on belonging, loyalty and solidarity, although generally seen as mutually exclusive, can indeed accommodate one another, for, she is sure, history notwithstanding, embeddedness and choice are not necessarily antithetical. Not perhaps necessarily, but in history all too frequently. The aspiration to dialectic has in this century more often than not been contradicted by the reality. Liberty and fraternity were brother constructs of the French Revolution, but like Cain and Abel were born to strife. Embeddedness means, if not exactly subjugation to an extended communal identity, membership in entities that constrain choice. J. S. Mill to the contrary, sturdy old oaks don't fly, as Edmund Burke might have reminded him, for Burke knew that men are not tied together to one another by papers and seals. They are led to associate by resemblances, by conformities, by sympathies. Rousseau to the contrary, butterflies cannot grow roots any more than contractually bound legal persons can nurture affection. As any naturalized citizen can attest, to choose one's roots is not the same as being rooted by birth or blood. A voluntary membership may bring with it a special sense of appreciation, I have become an American. But it cannot provide the sense of ascriptive identity that belongs to the native, I am an American. If the nation is always conceived as a deep, horizontal comradeship centered in a common language that permits the imagining of a common past, liberty and inclusiveness are at best likely to be contingent features of its landscape, and are at worst likely to be seen as inimical. In his seminal study in social anthropology, Community and Society, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, the 19th-century sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies concluded that the requisites of traditional blood and clan communities tended inevitably to yield to the requisites of voluntary and contractual societies in an evolution that pointed only forward, an evolution away from tradition, religion, and mystery toward contract, secularism, and rationality, whose final destination could only be what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world. The yearning for a reconstructed and remystified community was both fostered and contradicted by modern society's cold rationalism, just as more recently Jihad has been both fostered and contradicted by McWorld's postmodernity. Indeed, by the end of the last century the experiment with liberal nationalism, though it perjured in France and America, had largely failed elsewhere, displaced by Ortega's mania for fragmentation. Empire had made nationalism more rabid and parochially oppositional, and capitalism had driven it away from liberal individuals, agents of the bourgeois market, toward blood brothers, heirs to imagined ancient clans. Modernity meant modernization, which meant the aggressive expansion of practical mentalities of rationalization, bureaucratization, and secularization. These conditions in turn not only disenchanted and demythologized the world, but increasingly created a psychology of being in which individual self-determination and commercial consumption displaced community identity and group belonging. The consumer is perhaps modernity's most notable achievement, and the consumer is finally a solitary being. While Joel Kotkin's stretching metaphor to the breaking point has pretended to find newfangled tribes in the peoples who run McWorld's economic infrastructure, for example, Jews, Japanese, Indians, Brits, and Americans, Sikh, buyers and sellers are not particularly well understood by being cast as blood brother parochials. Many postmoderns have tried to reinvent community in the pallid face of contract relations. They all use history, but as Eric Hobsbawm noticed, history is the raw material for nationalist or ethnic or fundamentalist ideologies, as poppies are the raw material for heroin addiction, and since in the nature of things there is usually no entirely suitable past, where necessary it can always be invented. Community too is often a contrivance of willed grievances, drawing on an invented past. Most Hungarians, Tony Judt suggests, did not know that their nation had been born in AD 896 until late 19th century patriots told them so. That version of multiculturalism that infiltrates the pluralist many with a new ideology of, say, white Protestant or African American monoculture offers one example of fictive historical communities. Max Weber's myths of common descent invented to serve the need for a modern political base for group identity. Ethnic nationalism offers another far more toxic instance. Polish editor and social theorist Adam Michnik notes wryly that in Poland, putatively free of ethnic problems, we can produce a Polish-Lithuanian conflict, a Polish-Belarusian conflict and a Polish-Ukrainian conflict, to say nothing of a Polish-German quarrel in Opel, a pogrom against the Gypsies in Mlawa and an anti-Semitic campaign in a country which has virtually no Jews. In matters of nationalism, necessity apparently remains the mother of invention. More than 100 years ago, Marx had observed that the breaking of feudal bonds by modern capitalism had decisively fragmented traditional community. He spoke of the sundering of all bonds and prophesied ongoing cultural meltdown. All that is solid, he warned, melts into air. A half-century later, modernist anxieties had become popularized, so that one of American playwright William Saroyan's characters could repeat over and over again in the pre-war stage classic The Time of Your Life, no foundation, all the way down the line, and expect full sympathy from audiences already exasperated by modernity even before it had produced the Holocaust and the atomic bomb. In Germany they did not just whine about it, reacting against what they took to be the stultifying leveling, Gleichschaltung, of bourgeois society. The Nazi Party revived medieval myths of Teuton morality, a feudal version of family values, and of Germanic identity, ironically reaching back not just to a second empire of the German nation but a first quite non-German Roman Empire. Eventually, it rode to power on a reactive ideology of grievance dressed up in the claims of an invented past in a manner not so different from the one currently being fashioned by the far right in France, Italy, and the United States as well as, once again, in Germany. That the Nazis managed only to further the annihilation of intermediate associations of the kind that had once made genuine community feasible was an ironic compliment to their own unintentional complicity in the modernization they reviled. The irony is repeated today in the stellar rise and rapid fall of Silvio Berlusconi in Italian politics, a global corporate media mogul who owns Italy's premier AC Milan soccer team, using his media-made preeminence to give demagogic voice to the very parochial constituencies his media world is systematically destroying, and then being brought down by media-driven charges of corruption that make him look like any other politician. The same irony is visible in the startling juxtaposition in the new reunified Germany of heavy metal rock rhythms that are MTV's specialty and punk lyrics of which the young Goebbels might have been proud. Here is a piece of reactionary jihad all decked out in the metered hip-hop of McWorld, as written by the German band Final Stage. Times are tough for the German people. Foreign troops still occupy our land. 40 years of calamity and corruption. It's winter in the FRG. Will there ever be a Germany again worth living in? German culture, where is it these days? We meet at a dump called McDonald's. Lust for profits and power poisons our environment. This state is ashamed of German history. We've got as many foreigners as grains of sand. Pimps, junkies, it's all forbidden, believe me. Christians, praying won't do any good. It's winter in the FRG. Will there ever be a Germany again worth living in? Today, the forces I identify with jihad are impetuously demanding to know whether there will ever be a Serbia again, a Flanders again, a Quebec again, an Assetia or Switzerland or Catalonia again, that is worth living in. Immigrants from Old to New Orleans, from Old to New England, from Old to New Zealand, want to know whether the lands of origin that fire their imagination can be made real. And they gather, in isolation from one another but in common struggle against commerce and cosmopolitanism, around a variety of dimly remembered but sharply imagined ethnic, religious, and racial identities meant to root the wandering postmodern soul and prepare it to do battle with its counterparts in McWorld. Let's slip the fighting dog's leash and loose the savage beast of German blood on all the scum, sings the band Starcraft, Destructive Force. Not every partisan of jihad is so menacing, or so blunt, and this particular band subsequently betrayed the right and today sings songs urging tolerance and social comedy. But if democracy does not always necessarily appear as an adversary, it is rarely deemed an ally. Even among new nationalists who proclaim no animus against it, the bargain has been struck. If to overcome modernity, the modern liberal nation-state must be jettisoned along with its democratic institutions, that will be a justifiable cost of the war to revive community and insulate it from McWorld. The language most commonly used to address the ends of the reinvented and self-described tribes waging jihad, whether they call themselves Christian fundamentalists or Rwandan rebels or Islamic holy warriors, remains the language of nationalism. Religion may represent a more profound force in the human psyche, but its politics it finds its vessel in nationalism. Yet nationalism can be elusive, and its many usages are so variously inflected that it is not clear if a common language is actually being spoken. If, as Michael Ignatieff suggests, the key narrative of the New World Order is the disintegration of states and the key language of that dissolution is ethnic nationalism, are we to assume that this is the nationalism of Mazzini and Yael Tamir? Or the nationalism of the Nazis and Vladimir Zhirinovsky? Ignatieff speaks cautiously of a new nationalism, but strictly speaking, the sundry opponents of McWorld appear to be neither nationalists nor religious zealots. Their rhetoric is too worldly for true religion and far too sectarian and exclusive to be nationalist. The Crusades were murderous in their fanaticism but universalist and expansionist in aspiration, more imperialist than reactionary, which indeed accounts for their bloodiness. Universal ideals can create universal mayhem, while the effects of parochial ardor are often far more modest. Our new tribes are murderous and fanatical but small-minded and defensive, trying to secure islands of parochial brotherhood in a sea that relentlessly leaches away essence and washes away fraternal bonds. The critical question is whether postmodern new nationalism, with the nation-state as its target, is assimilable to traditional nationalism, on which the nation-state was founded. Rather than offer either a phenomenological answer, both varieties count as nationalism, or an essentialist answer, only this one or only that one counts as nationalism, I want to suggest here a more dialectical response. Nationalism clearly has now and has perhaps always had two moments, one of group identity and exclusion, but another, equally important, of integration and inclusion. Today's nationalists boast about their deconstructive potential and revel in hostility to the state and other constituencies that make up the state. In its early modern manifestation, however, nationalism permitted Europe to emerge from feudalism and facilitated the architecture of the nation-state. Early European atlases like the 16th century cosmography show Macedonians and Bulgarians, Danes and Vandals, Sicilians and Hungarians, both as constituent pieces of a larger body, a feudal empire, and inclusionary national wholes that assembled parochial tribes into national entities like Italia and Germania. Thus it is that the two moments of nationalism reflect the two moments of the feudalism against which early nationalism reacted. The political entities that brought down and succeeded feudalism had at once to divide and to integrate old Europe, at one and the same time to dismantle the empire of the church and weld together the provincial neighborhoods. Clannish loyalty and blood oaths were too narrow a basis for new national states, imperial contract and theological fealty too broad a basis. The nation seemed a perfect integer, holding together the tribes and larger entities that nonetheless permitted something resembling common culture and civic reciprocity. The new relationship was one not of fealty but contract, one that in the novel language of Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury pictured the king's power as embodying the wills of people understood as individuals rather than as blood brothers. The sovereign's authority derived directly from a contract among his subjects, who thus become his authors, his obedient but ultimately sovereign subjects. Emancipated from parochial fealty to kin and clan as well as from ascriptive subservience to vassal lords, newly created subjects of the British realm or of the French nation were little by little able to transform themselves from individual subjects into individual freemen whose obedience to the crown and responsibility to others grew out of rights they now understood themselves as possessing by birth and liberties they conceived as belonging to them by nature. Essex defined a parochial brotherhood, England defined the liberties of Englishmen. The feudal towns of Burgundy and Basque were walled. France was an idea that opened out to the cosmopolis. Feudal vassalage had created an intricate network of obligations in which birth inexorably controlled identity and identity in turn conditioned freedom, liberty being a hereditary characteristic of a single class. The new nation-state turned bondsmen into nationals and, in putting men on an equal footing, set the stage for a political theory of rights, resistance, and social contract, and thus for a political practice that would eventually become both egalitarian and democratic. Nationalism is a kind of group remembering of ancient stories of founding, and foundings were often midwifed by fratricide. But, as the historian Michelet had learned from the bloody lessons of the St. Bartholomew's Night Massacre, in which Protestant Huguenots were slaughtered in their beds, it also requires self-conscious group obliviousness, not just common remembering but common forgetting. Differences are held in suspension in successful communities of difference what civic nations are when they succeed, and that entails a certain amount of studied historical absent-mindedness. Injuries too well remembered cannot heal. The greatest peril to American civic culture today is the memory of slavery, kept alive by ongoing prejudice and persistent institutional racism. Without an opportunity to forget slavery, there can never be a chance for racial harmony. The burden, of course, is on the heirs to the slaveholders, not the heirs to slavery. In the peculiar transformation of nationalism in the 19th century, imperialism played a special mollifying role. The great empires spawned by Austro-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottomans, and to a lesser degree, the overseas empires of France, Spain, Britain, and the Netherlands, repressed the political expression of cultural identity and enforced a mutuality that made possible a more inclusive solidarity. Yet the empires afforded culture its own zone, and seemed to neutralize its toxicity without quashing its tastes. Ignatieff and others have perhaps overstressed the ways in which empire kept Kulturkampf under wraps and ethnicity at bay, yet there is little question that they contain jihad. Whether the ideological empire of the communists or the economic empire of the capitalists can be said to have done the same is more controversial. Certainly under communism the nationalities question that had so perplexed Lenin and frightened Stalin was kept under control, if only by propaganda and brute force. As the collapse of the great European empires of the 19th century following World War I catalyzed the balkanization that had so worried Ortega, so the collapse of the communist empire seems to have unleashed the new forces of jihad we see at work in Eastern Europe and European Asia. Whether that is because communist repression worsened things, repression leading ineluctably to explosion, or contained forces in a fashion that might ultimately have eliminated them is a contentious question we cannot settle. What is clear is that even communism's version of empire deferred the issue for several generations, sparing parents and grandparents the bloodshed being visited today on their grandchildren, though communism certainly exacted its own price in blood. Capitalist empire was less successful as a governor on the whirling dervishes of ethnic nationalism since its hold was less explicitly coercive and since, as we have seen here, commerce and markets can arouse as well as placate ethnicity and its counter-materialist zeal. That is precisely what jihad is all about. Yet times change quickly. Just a few years ago, astute commentators like Conor Cruz O'Brien pointed a warning finger at the Middle East, South Africa, and Ireland as the world's leading flashpoints. Who would want to make that claim now? Yesterday, Libya was Europe's prime headache. Today, Algeria causes more concern, though just yesterday it was France's most successful ex-colony. The devil may be in the details, but in world politics the devil is a chameleon, and no theory that dwells on one or another particular case is likely to survive the next political surprise. Hence, I hope in what follows to sketch a typology of jihad with at best what can only claim to be transient illustrative evidence. The data are too protean to be definitive and the events too vulnerable to distortion by the very probes that affect to explain them to be detachable from the normative frames by which we try to capture them. This is the general problem with pretending that social and political theory can be scientific. Although I can give neither the case studies I sketch nor the conundrums they raise anything like their full due, I focus then, without pretending to science, on 4 different versions of the reaction to modernity representing 4 distinct perspectives on jihad.